Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like, because the purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and any issues related to those issues. A hearty shout out to the Rabyd Nation. Join the nation by hitting that subscribe button, and if you want to support the channel in a more tangible way, hit the join button and your membership options that will lead to citizenship in the Rabyd Nation will be presented to you. Today I want to basically react to inspiring philosophies, the absurdity of Christianity. Okay, and this is something that Prophet Abzad did earlier, a week or two ago, but I want to react to it because I think it illustrates where apologetics is heading mostly, because they're not really trying to convince anybody outside the faith or the critics outside of the faith anymore. They're mostly trying to justify people staying in the faith. And I think this video is a pretty good example of that. Kind of a spoiler alert, I suppose. So without any further ado, I'm going to let Michael here do his thing and start off with this video.
The central message of Christianity is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Without it, there is no Christianity.
You got that right. Even Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 makes this point, that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, he says, we are of all men most miserable. One of the things that, from an emotional point of view, that a lot of people don't seem to get about Christianity is the incredible cost of it. One of the reasons that I run this channel and I end the videos that I do with the way I do it is because some people are under the pale notion if Christianity is false, then it has no consequence. I'm afraid it has had deep societal and personal consequences to anybody if Christianity turns out to be false. People have wasted a lot of their time, they've wasted a lot of their opportunities and all the rest of it. And Paul kind of hits that in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says, why do we stand in jeopardy every hour? Why have we suffered this? Why have we battled with the beast at Ephesus? He makes this long litany list of things that he has suffered for the gospel's sake and for Christianity's sake. And if the resurrection didn't take place, he realizes that all of that is for nothing. And so he realizes that there's been an incredible cost to him personally if the gospel message turns out to be true. So yes, the gospel message, everything hinges on it. If there is no resurrection, if there is no gospel, Christianity stands on a false premise.
But such a message has become a stumbling block for many, and a point of ridicule for others. Why exactly did God need to become human and die for our sins? The response many give is because this is the standard in the Torah of Moses. Only blood can atone for sins. But didn't God establish this rule? Surely he could have come up with a better way to atone for sins that did not require his own death. This is a separate question as to whether Christianity is true or not. Some finding an aspect of Christianity odd is not evidence Christianity is false. But for many, this has become a way to ridicule Christianity, a God who sacrifices himself to save us from the rules he established.
Yeah, that's the rub, isn't it? I'm happy that you kind of succinctly said here, the real absurdity of the gospel problem. Okay, it is an intellectual, rational problem of God sacrificing himself to appease the rules that he created. He could have created different rules. He could have come up with a different means than sacrificing himself to appease himself. Part of the absurdity of the gospel, though, that you don't mention, which I will mention throughout this video and a little bit later at the end of it, is that part of the absurdity of the gospel is this really a sacrifice? Is God basically sacrificing anything if he just experiences human suffering, dies, but then he knows for a fact that he's going to come back to life and be greater than he was? It seems like it's more of a cost-benefit analysis for God, and he decides to pay the cost because of the benefit for himself. That's also part of the absurdity of the gospel. This whole thing is an essential Christian doctrine, salvation. And while it's not as damaging as, say, disproving the resurrection, or whether the resurrection is true or not, the ideas of atonement and redemption through the cross are indeed absurd, and you kind of have to justify that, okay? Or you have to demonstrate how they're not absurd. But as we'll see, that doesn't really happen in this video. You're going to head in a very different direction.
But this problem is not new. It is an issue that goes back to the early days of the church. Paul even felt the need to address this in his first letter to the Corinthians. The gospel is a stumbling block to the Jews and a folly to Gentiles. Some cannot understand it, and others ridicule it. Early graffiti even depicts pagans mocking the Christians for worshiping a crucified man. But let us ask a simple question. If the central message of Christianity is so absurd, why did it not quickly die out? Why has it continued to grow and has become the world's largest and most influential religion?
See, now, this is where I think you head in the wrong direction. The proper thing to have done here is to demonstrate why this idea of God sacrificing himself to himself because of the rules he's created isn't absurd, that it's rationally good. Instead, what you do is you run to the other part of 1 Corinthians that you shouldn't have really addressed, which is to the Jews, this is a stumbling block. To the Greeks, this is foolishness. But to us that are saved, it's the power of God. Yeah, I know that verse very, very well as a former pastor and theist. Okay, but what Paul is doing there is the same thing you're about to do, which is appeal to the Christian ego. Appeal to, I've got something that nobody else has. I have the truth and everybody else has falsity. It's really an appeal to ego and an appeal to something that is very base in human beings, okay? You're going to spend a lot of time talking about how there's this higher thing that the gospel appeals to. But really, this argument is appealing to something very base in humanity, which is their ego, that they're right and everybody else is wrong. And it's a great defense of the people that are faithful. It's not really designed to convince anybody. It's certainly not. Such a statement isn't going to convince the Jews or the Gentiles of the truth of the gospel. It's purely designed to be written to the Corinthian church and basically say, hey man, don't worry about what other people say. You have the truth. You know you have the truth deep down inside. You know you have Jesus in your heart. So the rest of it, doesn't have to make sense. It's kind of, Paul knowing that the gospel is absurd, and so therefore he defends against that absurdity by saying it's still the truth even though it's absurd. A lot of other things you say here is kind of really weird. It's the thing that where you start to talk about religion and how, because Christianity has become popular, it's had a cultural influence, therefore it must, you're kind of indicating that, if it was untrue, it would have gone away. The problem with that statement is there's a lot of other religions then that are untrue according to your own doctrine that somehow survived. Why did they survive? Okay, and why don't you think that the same reasons that they survived are the reasons that Christianity survived? There are about 1 billion Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists, collected respectively as well. Does that make them true? Does that make them somehow valid? Okay, you as a person who says to be inspiring philosophy would know logical fallacies, that this is arguing from popularity, and that doesn't prove anything is true. Popularity has never proven that anything is true.
Historians have noted for years, Christianity has fully saturated our culture and was crucial for so much moral and scientific progress. If the idea is absurd and was mocked in the beginning, it should never have become what it is, and it should merely have been a footnote in some ancient historian's book that documented obscure cults. But the reality is different. Christianity has created the world we live in today, and has more converts than any other religion in history. So why have so many people given their lives to Christ, a God who creates rules where blood sacrifice is necessary to atone for sins, which he himself pays?
Influence on culture and converts are not proof of truth. Islamic influence on certain cultures is very evident, and they certainly have converts. You can travel through India without, you really can't travel through India at all without seeing Hinduism's influence. Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism permeate the Far East. Because, you make the claim that Christianity does this more than anyone else in history. You got some numbers to back that up? That seems to be an asserted claim that's very emotional. I don't really see that in truth. Hinduism has a lot of converts. Buddhism has a lot of converts. Islam has a lot of converts. In fact, Islam is growing and Christianity is actually shrinking. If it's so true, if I were to follow your logical reasoning to its logical conclusion, if Christianity is now shrinking, does that prove that it's no longer true? That somehow some other religion like Islam has taken its place? I mean, this doesn't prove anything, and it doesn't prove anything, so it makes me wonder who you're trying to convince. It's not going to convince me, the atheist who's on the ball, about what certain logical fallacies are. An appeal to popularity and influence on culture are not proof of truth. There's a lot of things have influence on culture that may be completely false. So, yeah, that doesn't really work for me.
In truth, the problem the critic has is not with Christianity itself, but with humanity. One cannot look at history and deny that Christianity has been successful. And a primary reason is because it taps into something within our very nature. It awakens something deep within us that transcends our reason and taps into a much deeper reality. I'm not saying the gospel is not rational. I believe it is. But it also goes beyond that, and it must.
The critic's problem is with humanity, not the gospel message itself, even though that is exactly what the criticism is focused on. It's this where I think you're trying to reframe the argument to your own ground instead of dealing with the actual argument about the absurdity of Christianity. This is where, in my opinion, where I said this on my Friday video last week, you jump the shark, okay? You state that even more things that cannot be proven. This is a deeper sense that we're supposed to have, that we prove this with our deeper sense that transcends reason, for instance. Why don't you just call this what this is? This is an appeal to intuition, which is not some higher spiritual experience or some higher knowledge. It's actually very mundane and very human, okay? All humans have intuition. All of humans think that there's something more that's out there that can be discovered. That isn't irrational or unhuman, okay? I don't have a problem with humanity, okay? I don't have a problem with the nature of humanity. What I have a problem with is God sacrificing himself to himself in order to appease the rules that he has made is absurd. And the idea that God actually is sacrificing anything, if he plans on resurrecting himself by his own power 3 days later, that's not really a sacrifice. That's the absurdity argument. It's not a problem with humanity, but I think you're going to try to reframe it as such because, quite frankly, you don't have a rational answer. You say you believe that the gospel is rational, and it's something I'm going to bring up often in this video, but you never bring up why you think so. Instead, you're going to appeal to human intuition. You do realize you could silence the critic by simply stating why you have the rational reasons why gospel is not absurd. But you're going to basically agree with the critic that the gospel is absurd, but that's what makes it true, because it appeals to a different side of our humanity, to this transcendent side, which is an assertion without evidence. You haven't really proven that. And quite frankly, you're not dealing with the criticism at this point, but you're framing this argument into something else that you'd rather fight on. You'd rather fight where you can preach to the choir than actually dealing with the critic's criticism. And, quite frankly, I find this a little bit of a cowardly dodge on your part. I don't say that you're a coward, maybe you're brave in other aspects. But if you really wanted to show some courage here, deal with the absurdity. Don't just castigate us as something that we don't understand, something that you do. That's not going to win anybody. It's a bad apologetic technique.
Because humans are not purely rational creatures. We often act on emotion or in irrational ways that puzzle even ourselves. In many ways, our psychology isn't rational and can be quite absurd in how it operates. So the cure for humanity must be something that matches it. And that is what the gospel is. It is an answer for an absurd species. It is a story of how God saved humanity through love.
So you basically say it. The gospel has to be absurd because humans are absurd. And then you claim the gospel is rational earlier at the same time. Perhaps you're saying that God appeals to the whole nature of humanity, but that's not where you're going to go. You appeal to both, say it appeals to both sides, but then you spend the majority of your time in this video appealing to the irrational, absurd side of humanity as somehow it's justified because we do absurd things, therefore it's justified that the gospel is absurd. I don't get that. I don't get that at all. I don't really understand why you would take this route, okay? If you're going to address the actual criticism, address the actual criticism. This really looks like, hey, you're going to sidestep the whole issue and just deal it with something else. But I guess we'll keep moving on through the video to see what you have to say.
We cannot deny that humans love stories. We live for them. We often relax at the end of the day with a good book or get absorbed in a good show. And after we have finished a good story, we crave more and seek out other good shows or books to enjoy. Stories have inspired humans for millennia. Many from the ancient world have survived to the present, and people still discuss their meaning and significance. It would be hard to deny that we are a story-seeking species. Telling and hearing stories is a deep part of our psychology. In fact, I doubt that humans could exist without stories. Wherever humans exist, they will tell stories, and in turn, stories will inspire and drive humanity forward. But stories also motivate us to be better people. The modern stories of superheroes have inspired many to dress up in costumes and visit sick children bedridden in hospitals in hopes to motivate them to keep fighting. You can beat this disease because you are strong like Batman or Spider-Man. Often we read of a protagonist in a story and desire to be more like them. Truly, I can be like Frodo, who made it all the way to Mount Doom despite all the pain and suffering. If he can take the ring that far, surely I can overcome whatever struggle I am facing. If Luke Skywalker can conquer the dark side and refuse to kill his father, I too can overcome the evil I am facing. But most of all, humans are captivated by love stories. We cannot deny we thoroughly enjoy a beautiful story of two people falling in love and living happily ever after. Many of the most popular films of all times either revolve around romance or had an element of that in the story. People joke about how all Hallmark romance movies are the same, and there is truth in that. But still, every year, millions of women and men tune in to watch the same generic couple live happily ever after. Love stories touch us deeply, because loving another and being loved in return is something we all desire. We may like action films, but not all humans desire to save the world by fighting off a villain in hand-to-hand combat. But all humans desire to be loved and find that special someone that completes us. So we cannot help but enjoy a good love story and desire to hear more and more of them. Often when we meet a couple deeply in love, we ask how they met and fell in love, and why wouldn't we enjoy hearing their love story? We think it is tragic when a couple splits that was once deeply in love. There is something about love that moves us in ways we cannot explain, and because we enjoy stories, a love story is especially inspiring.
Yes, stories can inspire and motivate, but that doesn't necessarily mean I want to base my life on those stories or develop a whole worldview because of one factor that may exist in stories, that they could possibly be fiction, and that I know certain things are fiction. I know, for instance, that Frodo didn't actually climb Mount Doom, and Sam didn't demonstrate his love to Frodo by being there, and Gollum in his battle to destroy the ring. That didn't happen. It's a work of fiction. I know Batman doesn't really fight crime in Gotham. I know that romance stories are mostly fiction and are often over-idealized beyond reality. Okay, but we like that. So it appeals to our emotions, but I don't necessarily base my life on them. They're a good escape from time to time. They're a good way of expressing certain ideas and things. But whether or not they're actually true has a lot of bearing on whether or not I'm going to take them more powerfully. If a true story is demonstrated and I see the story and it's a true story, that actually means a whole hell of a lot more than one that is fiction. Because I can say with that, well, that's a fictional story, that's idealized, that's somebody being romantic about it, it doesn't necessarily appeal to the other parts of my human nature. But when I know a true story, and I know it's a true story, that has a little bit more impact to me. And how do you prove truth? Well, you don't prove it with emotion. You prove it with rationality. You prove it with demonstrations of evidence that it's true. I don't base my life around living things that I know that are fiction. They may illustrate something else I know to be true because of evidence, and so I can use them as examples. But the fact is, all the examples of stories you gave, yeah, sure, they inspire, they motivate, they get our emotions up. But they're not necessarily something that I want to base my life on. I'd rather base my life on something that I can know is demonstrably true, as well as emotionally appealing. But then again, we're about to see you split those two things in a way that probably isn't justified.
But love isn't necessarily rational. Often falling in love is the least pragmatic thing we could do for ourselves. A young man will fall in love and spend all his time and money impressing that special woman, instead of trying to advance his career. To a purely rational artificial intelligence, love may come across as strange. A human devotes time, energy, and resources into impressing another human in hopes of gaining their affection. Wouldn't a more rational entity spend time and resources on making itself more self-sufficient? Opening yourself up to another person makes you vulnerable and dependent on them. Love makes us devote resources and energy away from self-advancing goals and personal necessities. Why would that young man spend thousands of dollars on a shiny ring to ask that girl to marry her, when he should be using it as a down payment on a house? After all, it is just a stupid ring, right? Why did that girl drop out of college to start a family with that boy she loves? Shouldn't she finish her schooling just in case it doesn't work out? Why did that old couple spend their lives with each other when all they did was fight? Wouldn't they have been happier alone or each finding someone else? When we are outside of the love story, we often scoff at it or proclaim we cannot understand it. Look at that young couple constantly wasting their time with each other. They should take a break and focus on finishing their schooling, perhaps date around and make sure they really are a good match. But for the couple, these words fall on deaf ears. All sense of what might be pragmatic or rational is powerless when one is drunk with love. Within their hearts, all that makes sense is they need each other and will fight to the bitter end to keep their love alive. A stumbling block or a folly to those on the outside, but to the lovers, it is life itself and all that now matters.
I think this part of the video engages in a false dichotomy, or it shows a lack of experience on the part of the person making the claim. The problem is you create this dichotomy of, like in this, you use the example of a career choice being, getting into your education and your career. That's the rational choice. And on the other side, love is often irrational and all this. And I really think that's a false dichotomy about both of those subjects, okay? A lot of my career choices over the years, and maybe this just shows your lack of experience with both love and career choices, but I made a lot of my career choices based on emotion. I would say my emotional choice to become a pastor was very much an emotional thing. It was about continuing to hope to believe that I would see my father again. I've already got all this sunk cost fallacy, which is a very emotional thing, into investing in this religious education, so I need to do something with it. There was a lot of emotional reasons that I became a career choice pastor, okay? And a lot of emotional choices for, reasons for doing other things like, need money, so I'm going to get another job on the side. A lot of my career and educational choices had a lot more to do with emotion, and sure, there was a rational side to them, but that kind of illustrates a point. The decision for a career choice isn't necessarily all rational. It's both. We kind of assess our decisions with our whole being, and that also is true of love. You see, sooner or later, that young lady is going to want some demonstration, some rational things that she can see that demonstrates your love. The story you tell, well, it's just a ring. No, it's not just a ring. Okay, even in the context of a materialistic world and us being a social species, that ring becomes a demonstration of I really love you enough to give up some of my time, work, and energy to demonstrate that love to you. That's a rational choice. Okay, the fact of the matter is when couples sit down and talk about their relationship, they don't just talk about the emotional feelings of love they have for each other. They also talk about a lot of other things that have a lot more to do with, is it rational for us to be together? Do we work well? Is this going to be good for a long-term relationship? If they're any kind of smart, they'll get some pre-counseling of whether they want to go into a long-term relationship or not, to have somebody else kind of have them kick the tires and make sure it works. You're going to also see when decisions are made to get married, what are we going to do? There's rational considerations to love all the way through, as well as emotional ones. I think you're splitting this into two very things engages in what I would call a black and white fallacy or a false dichotomy. You're saying one is completely rational and one is completely emotional, and that's just not demonstrated. Okay, it's often a mix of both. None of this is really a good example. From my perspective, my career choices had a lot of emotion to them. When I decided to get married, there was a lot of rationality to it, as well as emotion to it. Okay, we were trying to give good rational reasons to each other of why we should be connected and why we should get married. Back at the time, there were a lot of religious reasons for that became rational reasons, but they were career choice ones too. And often career choice and who you love and marry go together. Sorry, I don't really buy this dichotomy. I think you're really engaged in something that's either shows your lack of experience with love and careers or just doesn't really show a good understanding of how human beings work.
The old saying is love makes us do crazy things, because we recognize love doesn't come from rationality, but something deeper. Something that goes beyond rationality that we cannot explain. When you love, you act in ways you never thought you would, and yet, it is when you feel the most alive. Some skeptics might say this is simply our evolutionary nature to desire to reproduce. That is all love really is. But are we as humans not able to transcend our nature in ways that other species cannot? Humans have been called niche constructors par excellence. Surely we should be able to understand what is really going on in our nature and transcend it. After all, we have transcended other animal instincts in many ways, and created nations of laws that, for the most part, we can keep and maintain a sense of order within. Why not work to transcend beyond the desire for love itself, if all it is chemicals in the brain that make us do crazy things? C.S. Lewis might have said, if that is true, then you are confusing what love is and what love is made of. Our nature is a reflection of who and what we are. Some aspects we cannot transcend, nor should we desire to. In an attempt to transcend the desire for love and become purely rational creatures, we would lose our very humanity. Being human means not being purely rational, but being in part emotional and desiring that which cannot be explained by rationality. A purely rational entity cannot feel the wind between their fingers on a car ride through the country, or feel serenity in watching the sunset, or find pure enjoyment in simply watching two animals play. The worst thing we could do is try to escape our humanity into a transhumanistic dystopia. We would lose all that we most love about ourselves.
Yeah, and you continue on this false dichotomy that rationality and emotion don't intermix. They often do. I don't see transcendence in what you say of somehow transcending to a higher form of human nature. In fact, it's more of a continuation of the nature that follows as a rational course. For instance, you give up the idea of transcending our more baser tribal nature for creating government and laws and things like that to create a safer and more stable society, except all that is a more sophisticated form of tribalism, okay? And that we have learned and evolved in our ethics that we somehow realize, I'll survive better and I'll thrive better and I'll do better things if I cooperate more. Okay, that's not a transcendence of our human nature. That's a part of our human nature. Okay, and I think love has a rational side to it. I think career choices have a rational side, as I've already said. Okay, and a lot of the things that you talk about, love and family have rational reasons for existing. They do promote the species. Okay, but they also create bonds. They create checks and balances. These are all good things, rational things for society and for existing. They're not purely just one or the other. And I really don't care what C.S. Lewis says what love is. that doesn't mean he's correct, okay? And you do a little bit of quote mining here, but not a lot, so I'm thankful for that. But the fact of the matter is we have multitudes of different ways of looking at this, and you're trying to press it into this box because you're trying to make a final point at the end of your video where you can think that this whole idea of loving somebody is transcendent. But loving somebody is very, as you admit, very common, and there's rational reasons and emotional reasons for doing so. You make a remark about humanism, and I want to kind of correct that. Humanism takes into account all of humanity. It wouldn't necessarily lead to dystopianism. You're kind of engaging in a little straw man there at the end, where you say humanistic, dystopia. Humanism relies on human empathy to motivate and inspire. It just chooses to add a rational look at humanity and what we can accomplish as human beings, is so that we make good rational decisions that are also emotionally satisfying. This is something that you seem to miss, that somehow when I make a rational decision, a decision can also be emotionally satisfying because it's a rational decision. It's something that you don't seem to be able to connect in your brain. And that's kind of unfortunate, because if you could, you'd realize how absurd the rest of your argument is going to be.
Love may not be rational, but we cannot live without it. There is something deep within us that desires love, and not just any old feeling to help pass the time, but true love, for someone to love us unconditionally, every aspect of us fully, flaws and all, even though we may constantly tell ourselves we are not worthy of such a love.
The thing is, there's no real thing as such as unconditional love. Somebody wants to prove unconditional love to me, I already look and say, yeah, but there's the condition, so how is it unconditional? It's a nice thought. It's a nice romantic thought, and it kind of appeals to our ego a little bit that somehow we can attain this ability to unconditionally love another person. The fact is that people stay in relationships for good rational reasons as well as emotional ones, and there is because there are conditions to every relationship. In fact, having rules to a relationship and conditions to a relationship and boundaries is actually a good, positive, emotionally and rational thing to do. The conditions and boundaries speak against this unconditional love, though. Unconditional love just straight up doesn't exist, in my opinion. And so you're going to have to kind of prove that it does. It's kind of really sad here because you're making this boundary of, you're appealing to the emotion and romantic idea of unconditional love. But if anybody ever looked at their relationship, they would know that they have conditions to every relationship that they have. Okay, even family relationships can be severed if those family relationships become abusive. The abuser and the abused person can say, I'm done with this, and never have anything to do with that person again and be fully justified, in my opinion. The same is true with, we have this unconditional love for each other that we'll talk about on the day of our marriage, but have one of those partners sleep with somebody else, and additionally the condition of complete fidelity kicks in. And that condition also exists. And God, unfortunately, is no different, but more on that later.
But to our amazement, we can only find this love in the story of the gospel. The story of how God loves us so much, He died on a cross to save us from our sins, and give us the greatest love that could ever exist. The gospel is a love story, and we are at the center of it. We should expect that those who do not love Christ to scoff at it or mock it. It is a stumbling block or a folly to them, but that is because they are not in love. They have not realized what God has done for them, nor have they felt His love. But for us who are being saved, who have experienced God's love on the cross, it taps into something deep within us, the desire for a great love that completes us in ways we did not think was possible.
So the whole gospel thing is a love story. So I have some questions then. Is it true? Is it a true love story? Was it a real love story? See, that's where the rationality kicks into love. Because if a partner in a romantic relationship were to say, yeah, I know we have these romantic feelings for her, but can you demonstrate the truth of your love to me? Can you rationally show me your love? It would behoove the other person to find ways to do that, or to point out where he has or she has rationally demonstrated that love. I'm not going to base my life on what amounts to some cosmic Hallmark romance movie. That's fiction. And if this is a fictional story, I'm certainly not going to place my trust in it. And as much as you sit there and say, you can only find this in the story of the gospel or the cross, that's pure hyperbolic nonsense, okay? This is a common human story of somebody sacrificing themselves out of love for somebody else, getting themselves killed or whatever. I mean, you have this type of romanticized notion demonstrated over and over in every piece of literature sometimes that you pick up. It seems obligatory that we got to have a romance story in every movie these days, where somebody literally almost gets themselves killed or sacrifices them. I mean, some of the examples you had earlier, I mean, Sam for Frodo. Come on, Sam continues to follow Frodo and continues to try to help him even though Frodo casts him off. Okay, and in the end, this kind of love that he has for his friend, he ends up sacrificing and risking and everything else, and in the end, the objective is achieved. Mark Twain's Tale of Two Cities, we have somebody who literally takes the place of another person because they look almost exactly alike in order to save that other person who is innocent. It's like this is a common trope in literature. This idea that somehow this is the only place you can see this kind of love is just straight up nonsense. Okay, and it doesn't speak well of you to not be aware of what's going on in the rest of the world when it comes to literature and stories. The fact is, this is a common trope in fiction. A love so great that a person sacrifices themselves for something that they love. This is a common theme in literature. It's a common theme in stories. You've spent all this time building up the whole aspect of stories without even recognizing the very self-sacrifice in the people that you do. I mean, Batman tries to constantly puts his own life at risk to save innocent people. That's what he does out of love for other people. That's a very bold assertion that you only can find this in the gospel. And I think that's you kind of, stroking your own ego that you somehow found the story that was true, but you haven't demonstrated it. And quite frankly, without evidence, I would say you've made a bold assertion. In fact, in contrary to a lot of literary evidence I could pull out where you can see this kind of story over and over. But this brings up the original question. Sin is the product of disobedience to God, and God is going to cast us away for it. But somehow him sacrificing himself to himself solves that problem. It's a demonstration of love. This is where the rationality and actual love of God being unconditional comes into question. If God's love was unconditional, he would not have conditions of salvation. He wouldn't even create rules of it. Mankind could screw up, but because he unconditionally loves them, he's going to let them screw up without consequence necessarily. But you have sidestepped this issue this entire video, and now you just assert it as if it's fact. I'm sorry. Where is, the philosophy? Because I see a lot of attempt at inspiration of the flock, but I'm not seeing a lot of philosophical rationality here. This is you asserting that this is a love story. Has God done something for me? It seems that this could be rationally proven if so, much like the man can demonstrate that he loves a woman and wants to spend the rest of his life with him by rationally giving her a ring as a demonstration of that love, a ring that we could verify and see and do everything else with. Wouldn't God do that with us as well? But notice again, no answer, just an appeal to the flock's ego. They have the truth, so they should expect people to mock and scoff. That's not going to convince me, a former preacher of the gospel turned atheist. But I don't think that's your goal anymore. The more I listen to you apologists, I think it's more about keeping the faithful to the Christian religion or the Muslim religion or whatever faith you happen to be. Apologists are getting very good at these arguments now that have nothing to do with rationality and have everything to do with emotional appeal. If the emotional appeal worked for me, I'd still be in the faith, but it doesn't. And God, if he loves me, would know that and would seek some rational ways to demonstrate his love to me. And in the essence of the gospel, it would also be rational as proof of that. So, yeah, here we are. But let's move on.
The skeptics ask why God needed to create a world where the only way to atone for sins is death, and then God himself would pay that ultimate price. But they are looking for an answer that does not involve love, something like a syllogism or an equation. They're not thinking of it in terms of how lovers act, but how computers act.
So love justifies the Gospels being irrational, but I want to go back to something you said in passing. I believe the Gospel is rational, is what you said. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. Part of the rational Christmas of the Gospel is whether or not the sacrifice of Jesus is really a sacrifice or not, or just a minor convenience to an all-powerful God who knew he was going to rise from the dead at the end anyway. The Gospels make it very clear that Jesus was well aware that he was going to suffer and die, but 3 days raise again. How is that a sacrifice with the resurrection at the end of it? Okay, it's not a sacrifice, okay? It would only be a real sacrifice to God if God sacrifices his son and his son stays dead so that the rest of humanity can enjoy eternal life, okay? That would actually be a redemption story, more in line with, say, Mark Twain's Tale of Two Cities, where the guy literally permanently gives up his life on this earth so some other person can live a temporal existence. That's a real demonstration of love, I think, or at least heroism or courage or something. But this is not what God does. Part of the irrationality of the gospel is the fact that it's not really that much of a sacrifice. How is it a sacrifice? He endures minor suffering that he knows he's going to heal himself from. He's already demonstrated his healing power, and he knows full well in the story that he's going to go to his grave being resurrected 3 days later. If you have that knowledge in your head, how much of a sacrifice is it? Especially when not only do you get back everything you already had, but you gain even more by doing the sacrifice. It's more of a cost-benefit analysis for God. And God decides to pay the cost in order to get the benefit because he knows that he has the power to get past the cost anyway. That's not really a sacrifice at all. It's not even really a demonstration of love. It's just changing the rules to fit what he wants to do. And better yet, it's another human story about human sacrifice made up by humans. Okay, that would make sense, and then I could see the humanity in the story where humans are making up this notion. What if a God being had sacrificed himself? How would he do that? It's a pale attempt, and it's a bad one, but it doesn't change the fact that that's probably what it is. You're basically admitting at this point that Christians stick to their faith because of emotional attachment. I already knew that because that's why I stood with my faith. That's not a strong argument, though, because pretty much every person in any that follows any religion can do the same. It doesn't differentiate why your religion is true to have an emotional attachment to it, or because they have an emotional attachment to theirs, or why the gospel is rational given the choice of all other religion and philosophies one might develop an emotional attachment to. Islamic people have an emotional attachment and a cost analysis, emotional attachment to their faith. Muslims have that, Hindus have that, Buddhists have that. Every faith you can name has that emotional attachment to their faith. What differentiates your faith as true compared to the rest of them? You can't use emotional attachment if everybody has it. You can't gauge this, I'm part of this love story. Therefore, I have this emotional attachment to it, this irrational attachment to it, and it's okay because the gospel is irrational. If you think all the rest of them are irrational, they don't follow the truth, and they have an emotional attachment, how do you differentiate which emotional attachment is attached to something true? Well, you got to go to rationality for that. You got to show why theirs is irrational and yours is rational. You got to have some way of differentiating. And you've basically given up on that. You've tossed that aside. It's sad, because for years I was told to come to your channel that you would have answers to my questions. But you're doing the same thing every apologist is doing these days, appealing to emotion, appealing to the William Lane Craig, let's lower the epistemological bar and just believe. After all, the people that don't believe, they're just foolish and they're just stubborn. Okay, it's really you keeping your faith by maintaining an ad hominem attack against people that don't believe in what you do. And that's just not really good. On what basis do you say your religion is true and everybody else is false if everybody has an emotional attachment to their faith and all you're doing is appealing to an intuitive emotional attachment to your faith? You're not differentiating yourself. You're not showing why you're true and everybody else is false. And that's kind of sad, really. It really is.
God loves you, and that can only spill over into great acts of affection, ways to express one's love beyond mere words. And this can only culminate in the cross itself, where he gave his life for you, to rescue you from a life of sin, shame, and guilt, and to transform you into a child of God that is drenched in glory. If God is the very essence of love, then he loves us more than we could ever imagine. And if humanity is fallen and lost to the point that we have become his very enemies, how is God supposed to show his love for us in a way that would get us to turn from our wicked ways? If he desires to save those who hate him, you and me, how could he possibly shock us into the reality of his love? The only way is he would have to go to the bitter extreme of pain and suffering. We would have to see explicitly what our sin does to him, and how far he is willing to go, and how much he is willing to take, just so we know that he loves us. Humanity, lost in its sin, cannot be awakened by mere words, only shocking acts of love that shake us at our very core, that show us the gravity of our sin and the depth of his love. That can only be found at the cross, the day the creator of the universe allowed himself to be humiliated, tormented, and die to save you, atone for you, and awaken you. Why wouldn't we expect him to create a world where he demonstrates this love in the most extreme way possible? If God is love, we should expect his love for us to manifest in an act worthy to demonstrate that infinite love he has for us. All lovers cannot help but desire to show their love, and the greater the love, the greater the ways one wishes to demonstrate that love. And there is no greater love than what we find at the cross.
But what if it's all fiction? Because in order for you to prove all the assertions you just said, you'd have to prove that they actually happen. Otherwise, it's at best a fictional love story that you're basing your love on, like some starstruck teenager bases her romance to somebody else on a romance novel. Not something one should emotionally or rationally connect to as a basis for their worldview for life. The fact that your answer to the critics doesn't actually answer the critics is telling. You're talking to the choir. Now, the problem is you're still going to try to appeal to the critic. You're still going to try to appeal to those that don't believe. But really, your reasons that you're giving are really only reasons why you should stay in the faith, not why you should accept it. You've created this false dichotomy of rationality versus emotional intuition, as if the two never blend together for any decision. That love is purely this emotional intuition and career and education are pure rationality. But that's not true. You know, we make all these decisions based on both and many other factors as well that you kind of leave out of the equation. It's a very incomplete and very, shall I say, false dichotomy again situation. For myself, I find it very emotionally satisfying when something can also be demonstrated to be rationally true, where my whole humanity is addressed. You're basically saying I should be satisfied with the truth of the gospel simply on one part of my humanity, that somehow the gospel only appeals to that irrational part of my humanity, okay, and doesn't really do it rationally, even though earlier in the video you say you believe it's rational. Well, if you believe it's rational, could you tell me why you believe it's rational? You are saying that we're more than just rational creatures, but then you never really, and thus admit that rationality is part of our humanity, but you never appeal to it. You never go back to it like you should have. It seems to me if God does love me, then he would address the whole of humanity as a person, that the gospel wouldn't just be emotionally satisfying. It wouldn't just be an emotional love story that I find personally emotionally satisfying and grow an attachment to, but there would also be a rational demonstration of that love that makes sense. And the problem is, you're basically admitting that this whole gospel message of God sacrificing himself to appease his own rules that he created, and that somehow this is actually a sacrifice, even though Jesus is going to rise from the dead 3 days later and everything's going to be all good and even better. Somehow that absurdity is okay. But it seems to me that if God wanted to demonstrate his love to me, like many other ways of demonstration of love, he would buy the engagement ring and demonstrate to me how this is rational, how I'm willing to pay the cost. He would actually show me a cost that he's actually paid. Jesus staying dead would have been a good one. And he would have also showed to me that there's a rational side, that this message of the gospel actually makes sense too, that our love makes rational sense as well as is emotionally satisfying. Somebody can show their love as emotionally satisfying and demonstrate the rational side of it. Why can't God do that too? It would be able to stand up, this whole message would be able to stand up to the critics even more if you could also show the rational reason that love is present and the facts that back up those claims of love are also present. But you simply say, I'm special, I know more than you, and that's why I believe. I'm part of a love story, and you're not, and that's why I believe, and you do not. It's not because it's this or that or the other. It's just your stubbornness and your foolishness. Okay? And so it's like you're stroking your own ego.
You, looking in on Christianity from the outside, wonder why this religion has grown as it has, and why it still resonates with people. But that is because you have chosen to stand outside of the love story. You've not accepted the love that God has extended to you, which has brought us to our very knees and shaken something deep within us. We allow that to awaken us, and the only thing we can offer in return is to love Him back with all that we are. God did not need to show His great love for us, but He chose to save us. And how could His love not manifest in actions that are meant to draw us to Him? Those who reject His love will mock and scoff, but that is because they have placed themselves outside of the love story. But for us who are being saved, we can see the power and the wisdom of God in this act. A problem for those who reject Christ is they will still desire love, and naturally will seek to replace the love of Christ with the love of some other person. But out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made, as Immanuel Kant said. You may seek through the whole universe, but you will never find anything more fulfilling than the love of Christ. You may brush it off, or claim that love is unnecessary for your short life, but you cannot ignore something so embedded in your very nature. You may scoff at the gospel, mock it, call it absurd, but you are absurd, and an absurd species will require an absurd solution. A race created to love and to be loved requires a love that can truly save us from the incompleteness in our souls. And the solution is found in the last place we would rationally think to look: the man who died upon the tree, the God who gave His life as a ransom for all. This is a call from the Creator of the universe. You have been chosen to be saved by the one who loves you more than you could imagine. He did not send down a self-help book, a mere set of commands. He came Himself and gave Himself to you. Christianity is not a religion where you obtain heaven through your own efforts. This is a call to enter the greatest love story the universe has ever known. You are called to be united to the only God who can and will love you for all eternity. And when you reach out and touch the cross, all doubt and fear will be abolished from your sight. When you enter into the love story, what you call the absurdity of Christianity will be the only thing that makes sense.
So there we have it, the whole gospel in a nutshell, preached to the choir, preached from the pulpit, and then addressed to the critics. So what do you do about somebody like me? I mean, I never really believed. That's a common criticism. I mean, I know this message backwards and frontward because I used to preach it. But what do you do about somebody like me? I had a great deal of emotional attachment. I intuitively believed that the gospel was true. I was a Christian for years. I put up the cost of becoming a pastor, going through crappy churches, dealing with crappy situations, having my life hit from every side because of my faith, and believing like Paul that because it was true, intuitively true, that the cost would be worth it. I literally could echo Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 15 at one point in my life, that, if Jesus isn't raised from the dead, I'm of all men most miserable. But then I began to realize that if God really truly loved me, He would also have a rational message that appealed to that part of my humanity as well. Because I don't make decisions purely on emotion and intuition. I also make them on rationality, and oftentimes I combine the both. There's a whole bunch of things that humanity, that the gospel should appeal to, not just the love story aspect of it. There should be some things that are true. Is the love story a true story, or is it a work of fiction, is a real key component here. You can tell all the stuff about stories that you want to, but that's the real key issue, isn't it? Do you have a true love story? And the only way you say that it's a true love story is if you can verify the events, if you can show evidentially that these things did exist, that God actually gives us a tangible thing, a rational thing that we can look at as a demonstration of his love, like a man giving a woman an engagement ring. It's not just a ring. It's a demonstration, a rational demonstration of his love for her. Okay, and that's the problem I have with your whole analysis. And it's kind of sad. You know, you're heading the same direction that every apologist I look at heads eventually. They're going to appeal to the Spirit of God tells me that I'm a Christian. That's what makes it true to me. It's the William Lane Craig lowering the epistemological bar. And that's exactly what you've done here, Inspiring Philosophy. You've lowered the epistemological bar. It doesn't have to be rationally true because we're in the love story. And it's an emotional preaching nonsense appeal, okay? And I feel sad for you. I used to do this. What do you do about me? Okay, and people like me. See, the real thing that's cutting against your little apologetic form here is deconversion. If what you say is true, somebody that was experiencing with this love story would never give it up, okay? The Calvinists would be right at that point, but from a different angle, that if you really genuinely experienced the love of God, you would never give it up. But we do give it up. We do turn our backs on it, okay? And that would say that, well, why then did I do that? Well, you didn't really have love for God. There was something, whatever. And I'm like, well, then, but isn't there another side to this relationship that didn't have real love for me too? That if I was having doubts about their love, they wouldn't come across and say, hey, I'm going to demonstrate this love to you further. It seems to me that God as a lover of people, doesn't really do a good job on his side. He seems to lose a lot of people when a simple demonstration that the gospel is rational would solve that problem. And that's my real problem with your whole video. You basically jumped the shark, departed from the criticism, and actually addressing the criticism to just going off and reframing the entire argument the way you wanted to frame it, and then going off on a tangent and following that to the bitter end. And your tangent even wasn't really all that good. That's what's kind of sad about this to me. It's just, I used to talk like you. I used to be you. Man, you could be a carbon copy of me. A lot of the things I hear you say, I said 20, 30 years ago. And it's sad because if you keep it up, you're going to realize how much time you've wasted eventually. And that's the real issue. Well, I think that does it for this one. I'm not impressed. I'll just put it that way. This is a horrible argument for why I should return to the faith. I mean, I've already made all these arguments. And the fact that this individual claims to have some sort of rational reason for why the gospel isn't absurd doesn't demonstrate it. In fact, he basically says, well, yeah, it is absurd because it appeals to the absurd height of humanity. What a terrible argument. There's a lot of sides to humanity. Well, the gospel should appeal to them as well. If it appeals to me because it's absurd, why doesn't it also appeal to my rationality side? If it appeals to my emotion, why doesn't it also appeal to my mind? Okay, it should do both. If it's a genuine demonstration of love, it should do both. If it's a demonstration of a good rational choice, it should do both. But it doesn't. And unfortunately, Inspiring Philosophy kind of falls into Paul's niche of saying, well, you don't understand it, so the problem isn't me, the problem is you. Okay, you're stubborn, you're foolish, and that's the problem. I have the truth, and I know I have the truth. Basically, incredulity. So, awesome. Thanks once again for stopping by. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I really appreciate all the support the channel is getting. Thank you once again for that. And as always, live your best life. Don't waste your time, your money, and opportunities like Inspiring Philosophy is doing with the trappings of faith and religion, but instead give yourself to building your own self and building your relationships with the people you love and care for, because that's a rational choice, and building a better world, because that's also an emotional and a rational choice. Thanks once again for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.